Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 8th of July 2024. I am joined as ever by my co-host Mr. Andy Brockman, and together we are now living under a new regime, are we not, Mr. Brockman? There's a different government in power just down the street from you, or just down the road from you.
9 miles down the road from me, just over 9 miles down the road from me. As a result of the general election last Thursday, we now have a Labour government for the first time in 14 years, with a massive majority. The Labour Party won 412 out of the 650 seats in Parliament. The next biggest party, the Conservatives, who formerly formed the government, were down to 121. That they lost 251 members of Parliament in a day. It's the majesty of democracy, I think, that you can be on top of the world one day and then out of a job the next because of people exercising the right to vote. Fantastic.
Yeah, and of course here in the UK there's a very different handover to what you might see, for example, in the US, where there's a couple of months, or the better part of a couple of months, to do a transition. Here it's literally the election is announced, number 10 is shut down basically for most government operations, and then when the new prime minister is elected, they get to move in immediately that day. So it's incredible actually how quick things can change. And I don't know about you, but I'm noticing something which I'd sort of forgotten about this thing, that throughout my entire the lifetime of my business as Archaeosoup, almost my entire career as being an archaeologist under a Tory government, and that is putting people into positions of power who have an interest, or even, dare I say, a passion for their brief. That's been astonishing to see how they must have had this in their back pocket, ready to come in to government, talking to people about, you know about science, let's give you a science-related job. You know about money, let's give you a money-related job. Let's give you but the one that really impressed me and surprised me was the CEO of Timpson's, the shoe and key, cobblers and key cutters, who's done tremendous work over the years with newly released convicts and rehabilitation in that sense, who's built up a wealth of knowledge and also experience, being given the role of minister for people who've been released from prison. It's and rehabilitation. It just makes sense. And it's crazy how it's not based on how Brexity you are as a person, or on how well you know the Prime Minister's dad or something like that. It's
which school you went to. It's and I mean, Mrs. Soup and I and other people we know have been talking about this. In fact, we were with your goddaughter and her husband a couple of days ago, and all of us were sat around looking at these new appointments coming in, going, "Oh my God, I can't believe we've actually got someone who knows about medicine." Going into the health department. Why is this unusual? And well, I think just if we're going to go down this particular, I won't call it a rabbit hole, because we're exploring a brave new world. We'll call it this new road of government.
Yeah.
But you're obviously alluding to the appointment of Sir Chris Whitty, who was the chief scientific advisor to the government throughout the COVID pandemic, being appointed science minister.
Just
someone who genuinely actually has spent their career in science, being the government's lead person on science.
Yeah, and has seen and experienced the change of culture, not least in terms of access to international funding that came along with the Brexit vote. That's the thing that I'm most excited about. I don't, in that sense, I care less in that context about what party they're from, and more about the fact that how much of a breath of the fresh air it is to have, so even the Chancellor studied economics and has always wanted to be Chancellor of the UK. Like, that's
worked at the Bank of England. Indeed.
Worked at the Bank of England. It's crazy. And what I'm even more impressed by, before we get into specifically the archaeological and heritage sector on this, is the way in which these simple facts, this simple sort of relationship, must have been something that they identified months, if not years ago, and they didn't deploy it during the general election. There was no great list of appointments that they were going to make as part of their campaign. They kept the campaign simple. They kept it down to a few words to focus on, not least, for example, the word change, and just getting across the line before moving very quickly. I'm very impressed, and not least because of the way in which this notion of what could be seen as a gimmick, this idea of country first, party second, especially in the context of what we've had with the Conservatives over the past, specifically the past sort of better part of the past decade. It's so revolutionary to have this idea of as Starmer kept on saying in his acceptance speech, the new Prime Minister, service, actually being in the job to do the job for the people who have elected you, as opposed to being there because you've been given power by the people. There's a subtle difference there, and I'm hoping that subtle difference will make the difference in terms of those divergent lines where some people, for some, lots of my friends, lots of archaeologists, I think, are actually often quite left wing. Lots of my friends are going, oh, they're not Labour enough. But actually, just that subtle attitude difference, I think, will show itself in the coming years. Hopefully, anyway. Hopefully.
Absolutely, and always be ready. Always be ready to be disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, first of all, in terms of practical politics, the Starmer operation during the general election was utterly professional, ruthlessly targeted, delivered what they needed to deliver in spades.
Mm-hmm.
And so just on that level alone, if you compare it to the leaks that are coming out about the situation in the Conservative Party, where you've got cabinet members allegedly saying at the first meeting of the new shadow cabinet yesterday that Sunak calling a general election without consulting the cabinet was borderline unconstitutional. That the decision was crazy to go in June and July when they could have waited till September, October, November, and just the contrast is remarkable. Basically, the Labour Party operation was more prepared for an election on July the 4th than the people who called the election for July the 4th.
Yeah.
It's just that contrast, and then, as you say, Starmer's statement, and again he'll be held to it by the media, but that the government is there for the service of the country, including people who didn't vote Labour.
Mm-hmm.
And it's country before party, and I think that's a very deliberate reference to particularly the Conservative Party we've seen since Brexit.
Yeah,
where it seems government policy was aimed at two things, really, which was to, first of all, keep the Conservative Party together by keeping its Brexit wing on board, by going for the hardest possible Brexit, against all advice. And then, as we saw in the COVID pandemic, the billions of pounds that were spent, some of it, a lot of it, to apparently no good effect, because the PPE that was purchased has been incinerated as being not suitable,
or actually on
the NHS,
or
never delivered.
Well, and in that sense, on the flip side of that coin about knowing what you're doing and hiring people who know what they're doing, in that case, people who had previously been making underwear, just flipping and making masks.
And the key point there is that the government deliberately created literally a fast track for contractors who wanted to bid for PPE contracts. For people who had connections with government MPs, MPs,
as opposed to as we heard at the time, actually, people who were in the business not being able to, as the saying goes, get arrested in Westminster. They couldn't get any attention at all. So,
but Matt Hancock's pub landlord could.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. It never is perfect,
No.
and I've definitely been burned in the past by hoping for change, particularly in the US, which just doesn't come along with a new regime, a new administration. But I am, for the first time in well, as I say, in my professional life, quite pleasantly surprised by the, if nothing else, the signalling in terms of intention to be serious and professional about government. And I suppose, having now indulged our back and forth a little bit on this for the better part of 10 minutes, where do we want to start on the watching brief angle, on the heritage, culture, and so on and so forth?
Right. Well, I think let's start with the mood music and then get down to the detail.
Okay.
And for me, the two principal departments that are involved in culture and heritage, these are cross-government issues. The historic environment, natural environment, they all link together. They come through a number of departments. With culture, we are talking about the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. It used to be the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Digital was hived off in the Sunak government, and it looks as though it's going to remain hived off in the under Prime Minister Starmer. But there does appear to be, they made one ministerial appointment which suggests cross-departmental working, which again will be another really interesting thing for Whitehall, for departments to not exist in individual silos, but to actually have to take account of what other departments are doing. Whitehall is notoriously cutthroat in terms of departments trying to outbid each other for the limited funding pots. So to actually have some joined up thinking, it's been, it's long been a mantra that, British government would be much more efficient if there was joined up thinking. We may be coming, that there may be hints that that's going to happen, but let's see. I mean, in terms of the mood music, let's start with the DCMS, Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Now, we have an accidental culture secretary in that Tam Debonair, who was a Labour candidate at the general election, was the shadow culture secretary and was expected to take up the brief in government, as most shadow cabinet ministers have. But she lost her seat in Bristol Central to the Greens, and which left Keir Starmer with the need to appoint a culture secretary who hadn't been covering the brief. And everyone thought, Tam Debonair was going to be brilliant. Apart from anything else, she was previously a professional cellist.
Yes. Yeah.
So knew that particular aspect of the culture world, especially, and was seen to have done the hard yards. She'd been consulting, been taking part in, listening to people, and so on and so on and so on. Everything was ready to go. The new culture secretary who Starmer has appointed is Lisa Nandy. And Lisa Nandy again was previously in the shadow cabinet. She's a northwest MP. She didn't endear herself to some of the Labour Party during the Brexit campaign because she represents a Brexity constituency and supported a Brexit deal right through when other members of the Labour Party were trying to force a second referendum. So in that sense, she's some people in the culture sector might think, one of the big problems we have, for example, is international touring for our theatre companies and musicians, which has dropped off a cliff since Brexit because of the bureaucracy that's now involved. But she hasn't addressed any of that in her first statement. What she has done is make a very interesting statement, which has been reported very positively, for example, by Charlotte Higgins in The Guardian, and we'll link to the article. But some of her quotes are really, really interesting. The principal one of which, and it's quite a statement to make, quote, "The era of culture wars is over."
Okay.
Now, anyone who's been following the watching brief for the last few years, and certainly following Culture World for the last few years, will be very familiar with the so-called culture war. That is the idea that was imported from the religious right in the United States to other anyone who doesn't believe you, believe in the same things that you do. And not just to other them, but to describe them as dangerous, as subversive, as wanting to do the country down, as almost as even being treacherous. We've seen it manifested in these obscurely funded pressure groups like Restore Trust, trying to bring pressure on the National Trust not to cover things like links to the links to slavery in British country houses.
Yep.
We've seen over the statues war and the changes to the law after people in Bristol pulled down the statue of Sir Edward Colston, the senior officer of the British Africa Company, which traded in enslaved African people to the Caribbean in the 17th century.
And of course, we've seen it expressed explicitly in the reform contract, aka manifesto, when they were campaigning, talking about the national curriculum and what would have to happen in schools if something bad about the British Empire was discussed. You'd have to talk about something bad that the Dutch did, or something along those lines. It wasn't
exactly, or the Belgians, or the Belgians, or the Americans, or whatever. The idea there's been the myth has been put about as part of the culture war that British kids in schools were being taught that Britain was a uniquely bad country.
Yeah,
which is absolutely not the case.
No.
And in fact, what Nandi's talking about is rebalancing the situation. And again, this is a statement that she made just a couple of days ago. Now, whether this was written for Debonair to deliver and then Nandi's taking it on, we don't know. But whatever, it matters. And this was given as a mission statement to staff at the DCMS. And she said, and again, I'm quoting, for too long, for far too many people, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as a nation has not reflected them, their communities, or their lives. This is how polarization, division, and isolation thrives. In recent years, we found multiple ways to divide ourselves from one another and lost that sense of a self-confident, outward-looking country that values its own people in every part of the UK. Changing that is the mission of this department. The era of culture wars is over. And she cited an example of a play about working class women in Manchester, I think it was, about the 1980s miners' strike, and how moved she was by the response of women watching their own story portrayed on a stage by actors. And that culture is something that belongs to everybody. Every community deserves a voice.
But also the only reason that Shakespeare is seen as being elitist and removed from normal people is because it's quite old now. It's centuries old. So in some ways, the best plays have always reflected what the audience thinks and feels about the world, and plays with it and has in jokes and all this sort of stuff. And it's just that centuries later, we're still looking at that as being relevant. I'm not saying it shouldn't be studied, but it's just as relatable in terms of the audience as is seeing a working class story about factories in Manchester, or the streets of an inner town city life on stage.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Now, again, against this background, there's a poll out today which suggested that reform voters, for which we can read a decent percentage, not entirely, it's a mistake to believe that the reform vote, the far right vote, as some people describe it, the party that's led currently by Nigel Farage and funded by Richard Tice, and it's actually a limited company rather than a political party. But it's got 5 MPs in Parliament now. But the polling suggests that their voters are more likely than any other political grouping to believe that, for example, multiculturalism has been a failure and a negative for the country, that diversity is damaging, and so on and so on and so on. And part of the culture war has been about, for example, abolishing the posts of diversity officers in local authorities and that kind of thing, to people who monitor the way relationships with minority communities of all kinds work, and make sure that language isn't prejudicial and that kind of thing. What Nandi says very specifically in that context is that she talks about our story, our island story type, as Michael Gove used to refer to it. And she says, and it's carrying on that story about those Manchester women and the miners' strike. She says, quote, "It was a story that had been told about their lives so many times without them in it. And it was magical to see their response being put at the center of their own story again. That is how I intend us to serve our country." That word service again. Celebrating and championing the diversity and rich inheritance of our communities and the people in them. She's very deliberately pointing up that, diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, diversities of other characteristics are going to be accepted and recognized.
But also, I think that, and this is something which has always been at the heart of my understanding of good history education and archaeological outreach is that actually the old way of doing things, and this is often what people like Farage are pointing to, this idea of, well, back in the day, this is how history was taught, so on and so forth. That is just as exclusive as the so-called diverse curricula or focus of education and funding and outreach that we see people trying to do today. It's just exclusive in a different way. It used to be that you basically learned about kings and queens, you learned about your place in the pecking order, and that was more or less it. It was a matter of maybe you learned about there was a civil war, but it's okay, we like the monarchy really in this country. So actually, for people who I know, some of these people are in my extended family, in terms of people who get frustrated with the idea that diverse focus of education for history education, or for cultural funding, or for what you see, for example, in BBC dramas, etc., that more diversity equals less for them, whatever that means, and less less Britishness or whatever. But actually, what it is shining a light on what Britain in fact is, as opposed to having a sort of a single teardrop in your eye for the idea of Britain as it existed in the past, where you got polio, you worked up a chimney, and then you died young. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. But, and this is, I think, something which is probably going to be a thread that goes through a lot of the rest of this episode, is there has to be delivery, and also that delivery has to be for everyone, and just in that sense, proving the point that no, it's not a zero-sum game. We can talk about the jerk chicken being at the heart of Auntie's dinner spread for you and your family in the 60s and 70s, having come over from on the Windrush or something. And we can talk about flat cap stotties and being down the coal mine for you and your family in the northeast or in North Yorkshire, this kind of thing. All of this stuff is equally approachable and equally important. And I've never understood it to be anything other than that to be the case. But unfortunately, we've been swimming against a tide for a long time on that, haven't we? And so it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. Definitely.
Just before we leave the DCMS and Lisa and Andy, I just put again in terms of something immeasurable to check delivery against, and also something which I think we'll reference again when we talk in a minute about how Archaeology World has responded to the new government. It's about education in young people. And after talking about diversity and community, she went on, governments don't make this country what we are, people do. And whether it's through investing in grassroots sport, a visible symbol of what our young people mean to us in every community, or enabling brilliant working class kids to succeed in drama, dance, or journalism. Their raw talents so obvious, but for far too many of whom geography is destiny.
Yeah.
We will be a government that walks alongside them as they create that country I've believed in all my life, but never quite yet seen. Now, some people have said, but she hasn't mentioned heritage. She hasn't mentioned archaeology. I would say that's our fault. If we haven't made heritage and archaeology synonymous with drama, dance, and journalism, creative arts, that's our fault.
Yeah.
We've no right to be there, without putting the work in.
Well, and I mean, maybe this is possibly where we do slide into Archaeworld's response, because actually, to expand a little bit on that, we're at risk of heritage being seen as being something which the middle class gets to indulge in, which people with a bit of spare cash get to have a membership for, or to take an interest in their local historical society or whatever, and that is down to the culture that's been fostered within history and heritage, not because of people working on the ground floor. Incidentally, I know a lot of people, myself included, who've been trying, as I say, for my entire professional career, basically under a Tory government, to do this sort of grassroots work. And when it happens in small doses, it's wonderful and it works wonderfully well. I've seen, for example, kids here in Wallsend respond incredibly well just to a little bit of casual urban archaeology. Look at what's around you, guys. This is history. You don't have to go to London or to York or to Edinburgh to find your history. It's on your doorstep. But it's been underfunded and undervalued in terms of accessible educational programs and activities, and it's been increasingly hived off as being the focus of basically private funding through charitable endeavours, either long-standing charitable efforts such as the National Trust, or as was created under Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Cameron's Chancellor, hiving off the English heritage and historic England responsibility. So English Heritage continued doing its sort of admin role for the country,
as regulator,
as a regulator, whereas Historic England basically took on the legacy and the looking after the holdings of English heritage and the land, the buildings, and artifacts.
What's called the national portfolio of historic sites, from Stonehenge and Dover Castle down to a ruin in a byway up a country lane.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah. So yeah, there is an issue there in terms of what archaeology has allowed to happen, and also actually what archaeology and heritage advocates have been comfortable with happening, and this separation, you might say, between broad access and people who can afford to take an interest, as you might describe it, in heritage, basically boils down to money, and it boils down to investment and access to funding for the continuation of various organisations and improving the way that they work. So what did our new Chancellor of the Exchequer have to say about this sort of stuff?
All ministers, all secretaries of state have been told to push the idea of growth. Every department is a department for growth. Even Wes Streeting, the health secretary, the other day said that the health department was a department for growth because it was about getting people healthy, fit, and back into work if they're not in work at the moment for health reasons, so they can become, economically net contributors again. As well as for their own benefit. So there is this underlying mission statement which we need to take into consideration too. But funding in heritage and archaeology, and because we are now talking about heritage and archaeology and the impact of the general election on our sector, funding comes from many different sources. Obviously, most archaeology happens because of developer funding. And that is a function of the real world economy. If the economy is in recession, then broadly speaking, developer funded archaeology is also in recession, and people are laid off. There are fewer sites in operation, and so on and so on and so on. What the Chancellor, what the government has stated is that it wants to grow the economy, because the only way it can afford to invest in public services, in education, in the health service and so on, and in local authorities where a lot of, again, cultural funding, heritage funding, local museums, galleries and so on, where that funding comes from, many local authorities are on their knees. Some of them are on paper literally bankrupt because of what's happened since 2010. Again, just as a reminder, local authority funding to organisations like Historic England have dropped on average between 30 and 40% since 2010. And that's against a background of rising inflation.
And also, as well, the Tories had a nasty habit of deliberately underfunding those parts of the country that didn't vote for them as well. So if you're in a Labour voting area, then your budget is was more likely to be more harshly cut under austerity, unfortunately.
Yeah, just Google levelling up funding Conservative constituencies.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You'll see the way that allegedly it was the British version of the American pork barrel.
Yeah.
Now, what Rachel Reeves has said is that there are very tight fiscal rules, that she's inherited a very difficult situation, that if the UK economy had grown at the rate of other OECD, Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development economies, basically the leading Western economies, for the last 13 years of Tory rule, the economy would be £140 billion larger. And that would have brought in another 58 billion in tax revenue. They don't have that, they say. So what she's saying is basically we have to cut our cloth according to what we have. And for many people, I think that will be deeply disappointing, because potentially it means further cuts before there are any gains in terms of cultural funding and what's called discretionary funding. Some parts of government budgets are traditionally what's called ring fence. So, for example, the health service is the most famous. For a government to cut the health service budget in real terms would be politically very, very risky and almost unheard of.
Yeah. But where, for example, the British Academy can make decisions as to where aspects of funding goes, for example, the arts versus archaeology, they can sort of that's where discretion comes into it, and presumably a little bit of hands off in terms of what the government is actually doing.
Yes,
and archaeology.
Well,
archaeology definitely got short shrift of that under the Tories.
Definitely. And also higher education is a particular discussion point at the moment, with many universities in financial trouble because for all sorts of reasons, which are probably too complicated to go into now. But we've been covering the so-called hashtag bonfire of the humanities, where many universities are cutting humanities courses, history, economics, English, and archaeology. We've covered archaeology departments that have gone completely, even world famous ones like Sheffield.
Yeah.
And that threat has not gone away. But the immediate issue that many archaeologists are concerned about is, yes, higher education is important, and again we'll talk about the response of Archaeworld to that potential in a minute, but I think we need to start with the planning system, because so much archaeology is done under the developer-funded model, which is imported largely from European Union law, environmental law, under what's called the polluter pays principle. So that if there is a negative to the natural or historic environment because of a development, the developer has to pay for mitigation. And the planning process defines what mitigation is needed and over what time scale, and that the developer has to pay for it for the development to go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
What archaeologists are concerned about is that the requirements may be loosened. Now, we haven't had any more detail from the government on this yet. What Rachel Reeves said in her speech about the planning system, this was her first keynote speech on taking office on the 8th, and it was published on the 8th of July. It's on the government website, and again, we'll link to it. What she said was that there was nowhere that was more important to change the approach than in the planning system. She said, we said we would grasp the nettle of planning reform, and we are doing so, she said. Today, I can tell you that work is underway. And then she says that she's had a meeting already with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, to agree the urgent action needed to, quote, fix our planning system. And then she said she was taking immediate action to deliver this, with the government's mission being to kickstart economic growth. She says she's going to take the urgent steps necessary to build the infrastructure that we need, including 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. The system needs a new signal, she says. This is that signal. And then she says, and this is the only detail we've got so far. First, we will reform the national planning policy framework, consulting on a new growth-focused approach to the planning system before the end of the month, including restoring mandatory housing targets. Now, again, for people who aren't aware, the National Planning Policy Framework is the document which frames how planning decisions are made and what priority is given to, for example, heritage sites of either local, regional, or national importance in a planning permission, and also about and whether there's a difference between the way they are regarded in a local planning application and in a planning application for, quotes, nationally important projects, including nationally important infrastructure, like, for example, HS2 came under that categorization. I also need to make clear that among the government's announcements, Rachel Reeves' announcements, were that they will pursue a policy of what's called brownfield first. That is, that sites that have previously been developed will be prioritised for redevelopment, and everybody supports that more or less. The idea that you should not redevelop somewhere that's already been developed is really not tenable. And the contentious area is what they call grey belt, which doesn't have a designation, legal designation, unlike the so-called green belt, which is under the Town and Country Planning Act around certain of our large towns, and were designed to prevent urban sprawl, as it was called, the idea that urbanisation would just develop unchecked. It was designed to keep a green lung, really, around large urban areas. Grey belt within the green belt, the government defines as, for example, if you've got a former car park or a former out-of-town shopping centre that's no longer used, but it's within a designated green belt area under the Act, that is treated as though it's greenfield green belt, when in fact it's not. That's slightly more contentious because it waters down the meaning of greenbelt and the protection of the Town and Country Planning Act. But so we're not just talking about, as some, for example, opposition MPs are now talking about, the Labour government wanting to concrete over the greenbelt. That's not the case. What they are talking about is making it easier to develop certain sites within greenbelt designations. She has started doing things that they appear to be able to do without new legislation. For example, she says we are ending the absurd ban on new onshore wind in England. So that's the Tories, for basically political reasons, because it was causing problems in rural constituencies, banned onshore wind farms. Labour is backtracking and removing that ban.
Banned onshore wind, but gave the green light to fracking.
Yeah, we could spend the rest of the watching brief and more on the intellectual inconsistencies and all those arguments.
Yeah.
It was look, unkindly they were making it up as they were going along.
Mm-hmm.
Here we've got a government that's already worked out what it's going to do. Now, whether what it's going to do will survive contact with the real world legislation and campaign groups, that's another issue.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly free. I mean, for example, housing is one of the biggest issues that we're facing at the moment. Reeves talked about accelerating four particular regional housing schemes for up to 14,000 homes in Liverpool, in Worcester, at North Stowe and Langley and Sutton Coldfield. So, you know, that's, you know, all of those developments will come with archaeological conditions.
But will they?
If they haven't already been, if they've already been exercised, if they've not already been exercised, yeah.
But
because at the moment that's what the legislation is.
Yes, but we know that by the end of the month there's going to be a discussion about reforming planning policy, and in all of the language in the manifesto, in language surrounding this launch, in language from people who've done analysis on this, people who have an interest, for example, in urban development. They are particularly aware of green issues. They talk about the green belts. They talk about water quality. Yes. They talk about natural habitats. They talk about animals and protected species. In those documents, I've literally done word searches for archaeology, heritage, culture, ruins, etc., etc. I've tried all sorts of different keywords, and not a single one has them in it, has these keywords present.
Yeah,
that is a curious thing, and it makes me wonder whether or not. And the thing is, as you say, we don't know yet, but whether or not that is where the axe may fall. They are using language such as cutting red tape, which implies that they think there is stuff there that gets in the way of these developments. Now, some of that stuff has surrounded, for example, having better funded planning offices and officers, so that the actual administrative process surrounding planning is more likely to be able to proceed more efficiently. But I am curious about actually who's been having conversations with who, because even now, for example, after Rachel Reeves' speech and launch, in the BBC news article reporting on it, you had the head of the CPRE. Is it Protect Rural England? It was known as, or something.
It used to be known as the Campaign to Protect Rural England. That was its most recent name, and in fact now it's just basically rebranded as CPRE, the Countryside Charity. Okay. But basically, they look to the health of the countryside and everybody who lives and works in it as a living, thriving environment.
Yes, and it's clear though that they and others, like we know that the National Trust, for example, have been having conversations with the soon-to-be government in recent weeks and months. If not years, but even so, he's right there in the BBC article saying this is all good, but don't forget about green issues, don't forget about the green belt, don't you do too much. He's on it, as my wife would say, like a car bonnet. So, so in that sense, where is the archaeological equivalent? It makes me a bit concerned that that these words don't appear in this documentation or in the commentary. And, well, as we know, there hasn't been much in the way of public record meetings between heritage and archaeology officials and government for the past measurable time, months and years again.
Since hell froze over.
Since hell froze over. So where does that leave us? Because as it stands, it could be that actually history and heritage and archaeology looks like a place where actually the restrictions, the red tape, as they're calling it, could be cut. And it wouldn't go too much against the messages that they've been getting from constituents and from industry bodies.
Okay, let's step back from this and try and look at it in a analytical way, and look at it in terms of political framing.
I thought I was being analytical.
Well, I mean, you mentioned planning officers.
Yeah.
Now, in its manifesto and again in her speech, Rachel Reeves said that the government would be supporting local authorities with 300 additional planning officers across the country. That works out at roughly one per local authority, actually. But one of the complaints has been that planning decisions are slow because of lack of capacity within local planning authorities.
Yeah.
Cutting red tape could simply mean speeding the process up, as you said.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily mean removing conditions.
No.
And now the other thing, and again, I'll just throw these out there for the thoughts of our viewer, because we haven't got the evidence yet. Although, again, as I said, some colleagues are genuinely worried about this, and I understand that concern, and to a certain extent, I share it, given the performance of government in the past of all stripes when it comes to the historic environment and consideration for it. But first of all, Rachel Reeves said they were going to be consulting on the National Planning Policy Framework. Now that's a legal document. It lays down conditions that have to be observed by developers, and that has to go out to consultation, and then the government has to come back with an acceptable draft.
Yes,
and it will then be up to the various bodies concerned, from the industry, from natural environment, from heritage environment, so on, to look at that draft and decide whether it's acceptable or whether they will campaign against it, as they're perfectly entitled to do. Now, the government will say it has a massive majority and it has a mandate and it can bulldoze things through if it wants to. But a lot of that massive majority is in constituencies which Labour wouldn't normally have thought to have got. For example, in East Anglia, in the southeast, places which were formerly conservative. And there's a large increase in Liberal Democrat votes in similar constituencies, 71 MPs now, which, although, again, no way can they vote down the government, they can make themselves a nuisance.
Yep.
And also 4 Greens, including the Green who unseated Van Debonair, for the Shadow Culture Secretary, who we talked about earlier. They have really one job, which is to bark very loudly and, again, try and keep the government honest on green issues. And I'll chuck out one other piece of polling that was also published today. And that is that backtracking on environmental issues, and particularly net zero, almost certainly cost the Conservatives votes in the general election. It didn't win them votes.
Yeah, but again, you're still talking about green issues here, and
yes.
I know in real terms, in the real world, the historical environment and the heritage sector benefits from green adjacent legislation, and we've seen that groups like, for example, the CBA have been able to ride on the coattails of Attack on Nature, the
National Trust RSPB, etc. campaign.
Whose focus undeniably was green issues, was the natural environment, was, as I say, water quality, habitats for endangered species, and so on and so forth. I'm asking specifically, what can we say about what this government is thinking right now about heritage? Because, I mean, if you want, we can just move on to what's happened since the election, and the fact that we do finally have some commentary coming from our end, as it were. But I suppose, I mean, maybe I'm answering my own question here. We don't know, do we? Because there's been sweet FA said.
Yeah, look, that's why I'm being cautious, and I'm also. Excuse me. I think I'm also being realistic in that, and I've said it many, many times before, and I will go on saying it. The natural environment and the historic environment are aspects of the same thing.
Not for everyone, though, and this is my point.
Well, you will. Yeah, there are variations on within that, but in terms of the legislation and the aims of the legislation, and the NPPF and so on. For example, we mentioned Rachel Reeves was going to they were going to adjust the national planning policy framework to make it growth focused. It already is.
It is language that we've heard before. For example, under George Osborne, Cameron's Chancellor of the Exchequer, planning policy framework reassessment, rewriting was called unashamedly pro-growth. That was the exact quote. And that resulted in a lot of difficult conversations about the status of heritage in local planning and even national planning considerations. I'm just aware. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just aware of the potential wriggle room that exists in all of the language surrounding the manifesto, the policy launch, and also, as she says, by the end of the month, we're going to see this conversation beginning in the House of Commons. The fact that the presence of language about the green environment, water quality, animal habitats, so on and so forth, compared to the literal absence of words like heritage, local history, artifacts, remains, so on and so forth. Why do you think this has happened? Why do you think we're in a situation where not only are green lobbyists seeing their interests in manifestos that are now about to become potentially law, but also as well they're still biting at the heels of government, whereas what? Like, where's the equivalent from archaeology and history and heritage?
Well, we've been covering for many years how in a lot of these area discussions which venture into the political area, archaeological groups, leading archaeological bodies, archaeological leadership bodies, either keep whatever it is they're doing behind closed doors. They don't make public statements. They don't issue press releases, until, with one exception, very, very recently. We'll come to that later.
Yeah,
but they don't behave like organisations that are operating in the public sphere, even though they claim to represent the public.
And
a large membership.
Well, and they claim to want to influence public policy as well.
Yes, exactly. They want to influence public policy, but they don't want accountability.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a democratic deficit. But I would do that. I investigate this stuff. I try and discover what they actually think and what they're actually doing and make it public, because it's in the public interest, I think. And our audience, I think, agrees with that by and large.
So is it a case of, long story short, at the moment we can't say much about planning and heritage because we just don't know?
We've got very little evidence from either side as to what's going on.
Yeah.
I think when we do have the proposals from government, which, as we said, are promised by the end of this month, July 2024. And see the draft rewrite of the National Planning Policy Framework, then we'll have something specific to discuss, to risk assess, and to respond to. Until that happens, we're speculating, and really there's not much point. I think in terms of one other piece of background intel, if you like, in terms of where all this is going and where the real issues are going to be for archaeology and heritage in the next few months, when the government does finally come through with its proposals. I mentioned, obviously, Rachel Reeves is the most important figure after the Prime Minister in this, because she's the person that holds the purse strings. But the government's two most senior legal officers come from a very well regarded and quite an activist chambers called the Matrix Chambers, based in London. Now, in terms of their experience before they became MPs, Sarah Sackman, who has just been made Solicitor General, having only just been elected to Parliament. So the government's second most senior legal officer after the Attorney General, who is also from Matrix Chambers. But Sarah Sackman is a specialist in planning law. Right? So I'll repeat that for the harder thinking. The government's second most senior legal officer is a specialist in planning law.
Mm-hmm.
Her clients have included Friends of the Earth. Right? And the a minister of state, a junior minister at the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, Ed Miliband's department, is another new MP called Miata Fambula. And she was previously a civil servant and worked on the initial drafts of the National Planning Policy Framework back in the 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
That is two really experienced former officials, former lawyer turned politicians who are going to be taking leading, are involved in departments that are going to be taking leading roles in this.
And this also speaks to what you were saying earlier about cross-departmental pollination.
Precisely.
And thinking. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what I would say to our colleagues out there in Archaeworld is you had better be prepared to respond to this with a similar level of preparation and professionalism.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so sorry, Andy. I like we've had what, less than a week to be somewhat hopeful and or possibly even jubilant, and I'm finding myself yet again just frustrated with professional responses from the heritage world in terms of seemingly a reticence to engage with stuff that may not be the stuff that they did for their degree, but absolutely has a bearing upon whether or not they have a profession. And yeah, I suppose it's worthwhile at this point moving on to what we have seen, and that was a few days ago. CIfA, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, did make a statement and published a couple of links, including a PDF document. But the statement was 2 days ago as of recording. Chartered Institute for Archaeologists on Facebook. The new Labour government has promised rapid and bold changes to planning to enable the system to get more houses built, speed up decision making and invest in skills, which has implications for archaeology. CIfA has set out its advocacy objectives with the new government in this briefing. I'll come to the briefing in just a second. There are many other challenges facing the nation and affecting archaeology. Skills retention, absolutely. Local government finances, definitely, including squeezed discretionary spending for heritage provisions and planning services, and delivering action
we've just been talking about
on biodiversity and climate crises. So CIfA are making a connection there, which is fair enough. Yes. We also expect the comprehensive spending review will likely be a difficult one for public bodies. An informal online election debrief event will be held on the 18th of July. That is, as of recording, in 8 days' time, at 1 p.m. with CIfA's Policy and Advocacy Manager. I didn't realise they had one. Rob Lennox. Excellent. Okay, cool. So there's a link there. Again, we'll link to this below. The final paragraph. CIfA's CEO, Nathan Baker, said, "We are excited to welcome the new government with a small g. And are energized by the prospect of change. We will be working hard to make sure that this change is driven by the opportunities archaeology provides to make people's lives better, shape great places, and inspire communities. We are looking forward to meeting new ministers and engaging with officials to yield the public benefit of archaeology. For further information about CIfA and how we're advocating on behalf of archaeology to the new government, and for details of the online election debrief event, go to these links here. Again, we'll link to those below. That was something. That was something, which is good. Which is, oops, sorry, my phone made a noise there. Which is fantastic. I'm very pleased to see that. What do you make of that as a piece of communication? And I suppose my little bit of bitterness to go with the pill is that is happening now, when you've got ministers who are settling into their offices,
still very excited about getting their pass to, behind the scenes at government or whatever. Basically, they're not really actually listening to what CIfA are putting out on their Facebook page. Why now and why not 6 weeks ago? I suppose that's my only frustration there. But what do you make of it? I think it's a good. It sounds good, reads good.
I think there are two words to explain it, and that's Nathan Baker.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan Baker is the new chief executive of CIfA, Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and he only took up his post last month in June,
right,
during the general election campaign.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing here is a very deliberate change in approach from the previous regime at CIfA. Now, I should maybe explain to our viewer who isn't a member of CIfA. CIfA is the professional body, sets out to be the professional body for UK and actually international archaeologists. It sets itself out as a regulator of professional standards and so on. A chartered institute, not a trade union, as it always is very happy to point out. It's not compulsory to be a member to practice as an archaeologist in the UK. It's not like
you don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps.
it helps in its membership of CIfA is seen as by potential commissioners like local authorities as a sign of professional standards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's why CIfA is important, and it has a pretty high membership relative to the overall number of archaeologists working in the UK. Principally, but not entirely, in the developer-funded sector. Hence, the issue of pay has been so contentious. Paying conditions has been so contentious with CIfA this year, as we've discussed previously. Now, the mess that CIfA got into over paying conditions and will it campaign or won't it campaign and can it campaign and can't it campaign and is it legal to campaign and all that other stuff that it chased its tail over happened before Nathan Baker took over.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Baker, by background, he was a British Army officer and then moved into industry. He then moved into administering various professional bodies, including working as development director at the Sector Skills Council for Energy and Utilities. Now, again, you can see sector skills, CIfA, training standards. You can see a synergy there. And most recently, he was the chief executive of the Institute of Occupational Medicine. That's a health protection and research charity. So again, very like CIfA. But he's not an archaeologist. He's a clean skin, if you like to use that term. And I think he's bringing a new approach to how CIfA promotes itself, presents itself. And the fact that he's out there on July the 5th, the day of the election count, basically, the day that Starmer's victory was confirmed, and CIfA are welcoming the new government and quoting the chief executive in quotes in a press release, in a public release to its members, but it's an open release. I think that's a significant change of approach. Now, we'll see whether that has any effect on other sector bodies like the CBA, where I've done a cursory look at their social media feeds, and I can't find anything that's not that's specifically about the election, the new government, or anything along those lines. Understandably, but primarily at the moment they're promoting the Festival of British Archaeology, which is their big event of the year. It happens to start next week. But I think to see this from CIfA is really, really interesting, and it's something to watch and something to be welcomed, actually, because it's acknowledging that there are issues here that are public issues, public interest issues, which they need to be seen to engage with and proactively engage with, not be dragged kicking and screaming by the discontent of their members into making a comment. And usually after making a comment, making things actually worse.
Yes. No, exactly. Yeah. And again, as you say, it's a clear document. It's 3-page PDF. General election 2024 priorities for archaeology, and goes on from there. It's not groundbreaking stuff, but it is clear, and hopefully it is the sort of communication that we might see more of. Shall we chance our arm and ask if he's up for an interview?
I think we should probably give that a go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In all seriousness, no. I think. I mean, I would. Given that we're at the beginning of potentially a new era in British archaeology, certainly in developer-funded archaeology, in archaeology as it interacts with the rest of public life, industry, the economy, and bearing in mind as well. I mean, the issue, we don't want to give the impression that, for example, building houses is a bad thing. It's not. Archaeologists need places to live, for goodness sake.
If anyone needs affordable housing.
Exactly. Again, a lot of the criticism of CIfA's previous regime for not engaging with the pay issue as directly as many members wanted was the fact that the first two grades of previously recommended CIfA minima fell below the average national wage. It's one of them is barely more than the lowest grade is barely more than the national living wage. There are many reasons for archaeologists to want to engage and support what the government's trying to do. But in terms of sector interest, it's making sure that the responsibility we've given ourselves by taking part in this sector to promote and protect our shared heritage, our historical, our historic environment, with and alongside and part of the natural environment, are given proper, timely consideration. So, for example, that an archaeological condition is exercised before planning permission is granted, not afterwards. So that if something unexpected turns up, you're in another Rose Theatre situation when you're trying to, firefight a PR and an academic disaster.
Yeah, or I suppose even to put it even more simply, so that the assessment of what's there is part of the permission to build. And so, in that sense, you're not only heading off a disaster, but also what you're doing is you're making sure that developers know what they're getting into financially. That the local authority has a chance to understand what this permission means. It makes sense.
All of that. I mean, one of the criticisms in the attack on nature was that the government was the Truss government. The short-lived government of former MP Elizabeth Truss, and that was a great moment that night. No, the one criticism of the under the attack on #attack on nature campaign was that the government was looking to move to what's called a zonal planning system, where zones of the country will be designated, whereby there will be a presumption that planning permission would be granted without doing any proper assessments of what might have been there in a historic and natural environment that would be impacted by that development. So this is where this is where we're going to see, push comes to shove, how effective CIfA can be, how effective CBA can be. And FAME, we can debate why they are silent on this issue. That's the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employers. One can speculate, I think, that FAME doesn't want to do or say anything that its clients in the development industry would see as impacting on their projects, and particularly their project costs.
It's interesting. I suppose the real world of that relationship is interesting. Okay, so to wrap this up then, what should we keep an eye on? I suppose first of all I should say to folks at home, next week we're going to be talking about things non-UK political based. That's going to be amazing for our international audience. There's going to be some other stuff coming in, and also we have we do still have that unstratified archaeology media treat lined up for you as well. But what should we keep an eye out for then with this planning policy framework reassessment coming down the tracks?
The key moment is going to be the publication of the proposed changes to the NPPF. That's going to be the moment when the rubber hits the road, to coin the phrase.
Okay. Okay. And we're going to be there with a microscope looking at the road.
Can I make one last comment? And it broke
Yeah.
just before we started recording.
Mm-hmm.
It may well be, and has a slight connection with the British general election, but it may well be that a digital channel has finally commissioned a documentary series that will be more fake news and fake history than Ancient Apocalypse. It will make Ancient Apocalypse look like the Victoria County History or the Archaeological Journal.
Okay.
Discovery Plus have just announced that they've commissioned a reality TV series called Meet the Rees-Moggs.
Oh, no. No. No.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh.
For anybody who has the good fortune not to know who I'm talking about, I'm talking about a reality series about a British, well, now ex-MP, thankfully. Again, another great moment from general election night. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Conservative MP, colloquially known as the Honourable MP for the 18th century.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, the Haunted Pencil, because he's very thin and tall.
Yes.
He is an old Etonian. He's a sort of faux aristocrat. In fact, I don't believe in the class system in this respect, but people would say that he's actually not, for all the for a very plummy accent that he puts on and pinstripe suits. And in fact, he's an old Etonian. He's trade.
Yeah, the affectation though is there. Yes.
Yeah, he affects to a lifestyle to which his family actually have in the most recent generation. Not attacking that in the. He's also a devout Catholic. He has 6 children, which is part of the reality series. The Rees-Moggs plural include his 6 children, and he's tried to create this image of a sort of plain speaking, honourable, very incredibly polite individual. In fact, he was a fanatical Brexiteer. He had a habit of leaving passive aggressive notes on the desks of civil servants who were working from home during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
Along the lines of, "I hope you'll be here next time I come by."
He basically.
I'm sorry to have missed you. He was saying.
Yeah. Basically, folks at home, he's kind of he's the most Dickensian villain you can think of. He's just this, grim spectre. Yeah. But also Kardashian, he ain't. Just. Why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this to me, Andy? Why?
No, Mark, hang on. You may not be a Kardashian, but so far as we're aware, none of the Kardashians were flown to Balmoral to lie to the Queen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Jacob was.
Yeah, he's also in that sense a liar and a betrayer of our unwritten constitution. Wonderful.
A constitution which is very happy to quote ad nauseum, and the other final sort of gem about him is the fact that an ardent Brexiteer, the hedge fund that he co-founded, relocated to Dublin for business reasons after Brexit.
I'll say it again. Why are you doing this to me? We're 6 days into a new government, and you've sullied our shared digital space with that man's name. It's just, yeah.
I'm sorry. I just report the news. I don't make it. And the other thing I would say is, we're having to talk about things like the former member for North Somerset in the 18th century, because at the moment the Labour Party hasn't been in power long enough to develop its own characters and scandals like this. So and I'm sure we'll be reporting on them in due course, impartially as well.
Yeah, okay. He also wrote a terrible book on the Victorians, didn't he, as well?
He did. In fact, if you Google, we'll put the link to it, but it's one of the worst reviewed history books in living memory. It's the reviews are obviously much more fun to read than the book was.
Yeah.
But at least, to be fair to him, at least he delivered the book to his publisher, unlike Boris Johnson's biography of Shakespeare, based on other people's notes, which he hasn't written up the notes yet. In spite of getting a reported art, he was £500,000 advance.
You're just addicted to hurting me, aren't you? That's it. Rees-Mogg in one ear, Boris Johnson in the other. Right, folks. Yeah, great. We're going to see what happens next with this wonderful, shiny new government that doesn't have such clownish buffoons yet identified within it. Until next time, do take care. Keep an eye out for that media special, where hopefully we'll have just as much fun talking about archaeology presentation and history media in a slightly broad strokes. Actually, it came about through a conversation.
But if our viewer does want to do some homework, check out the trailer for Gladiator 2 that's currently doing the rounds on social media.
Yeah, but again, you could stop hurting me. Like this is abuse.
Why should you be hurt? It's an exciting, classy trailer for a sequel to a classic film.
It is that. Do consider supporting us on Patreon so I can afford some therapy following this, and also as well check out Andy's Ko-fi account and buy him. I don't know. Some poison, whatever. No, honestly, not. But yeah, Rees-Mogg, man, that came out of nowhere.
And if you're thinking of saving money in these straitened times by cutting one of your digital subscriptions after Discovery Plus have commissioned the Rees-Mogg, meet the Rees-Moggs, that might be one to consider.
It might be. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.